The United States has a strange way of electing its president. It's based on voting, but there's more to it than that. If the number of votes candidates got, and having the most votes got you elected president, well, Al Gore would have gone to the White House and George Bush would have gone home. Instead, it was Al Gore who went home and George Bush who was elected. If just having the most votes was enough to get you elected president, Hillary Clinton would have gone to the White House and Donald Trump would have gone home. She actually got 3 million more votes than Trump did, but she didn't win. The reason is a strange system called the Electoral College, and the impact it has is seen basically every time Americans elect their president. In fact, going back a quarter of a century, the Republicans virtually never would have won the White House, but they did, because the Electoral College is more important than just the number of voters turning out to choose their leader. The U.S. has a strange system. It's complicated and hard to understand, but the most remarkable thing about it is that it has its roots in slavery. And that's probably the strangest thing of all. Wilfred Codrington is a professor at the Brooklyn School of Law and knows all about this. If anyone were going to choose how to elect a president for the United States or any other country today, would they choose a system like the Electoral College, or is this country just stuck with this bizarre antique from a long time ago that doesn't make a whole lot of sense?
In short, no. We can look at the 50 states and other jurisdictions in the United States and just look how they do it, right? They choose the head of their state or their jurisdiction by popular votes. That's what most of the country does. In fact, there was one place in Scandinavia that used to use an electoral college type system and got rid of it quite quickly afterwards. So no, especially in the United States, where we think about every person's vote counting equally, this is just an aberration in many regards, and it's because it is entrenched in the Constitution.
So let me ask you the tough question now. Can you explain the Electoral College? Because it's complicated.
We'll start out by the fact that basically when you are elected president, you are elected by the total number of electoral votes in each state, right? So every state gets a certain allotment of electoral votes, and it's partly based on their population. So everyone gets at least 3, because everybody gets at least 3 members of Congress, 2 senators, and 1 representative, and that's the formula on which the Electoral College is based on. And then after that, it's all basically your population that dictates how many more you get. So a place like California, which is the largest population, followed by Texas, they have more electors than your places like Montana and Wyoming, which have smaller populations. However, the way that this system works out is that the people in the smaller states still get an outsized say because they get an automatic 3 irrespective of what their population is. So California has nearly 40 million people, and it basically your vote counts less there in the president than it does in a place like Wyoming, which has about 600,000 people. All of these electors, their votes are aggregated across the states, and you need 270 of them to win now, because that's half plus 1.
Why did the Founding Fathers choose to do it that way?
Sure, yeah. So I'll give you sort of 3 reasons. The bigger reason is that it was the most acceptable to the most people in the room designing the system. That is, nobody really loved anything that was on the table, and yet everybody could be fine with this one as a second or third choice, right? It's very complicated, but it also had some incentives. The second reason is a wariness or skepticism about democracy. So the framers, if you look at the records from the Philadelphia Convention, they are pretty open about their disdain for the sort of understanding of politics and government of the common person, right? And so the Electoral College, by putting these electors in place as mediators between the vote of the people, if that's the way that it was going to be chosen, and the actual selection, then it kind of moderates what the people are saying. So if you don't trust people, you create some sort of mediator in between. And the third one is actually probably the most odious, definitely the most odious, and that is to sort of incentivize slavery, right? And so this was why the South actually was a proponent of the Electoral College more than other places. So the Electoral College, because of the formula that it was designed on, gave a baked-in advantage to the South. There's a provision of the Constitution that's called the 3/5 Clause, and functionally what it did is for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College, it basically counted every three out of every 5 slaves towards a state's population. So all the states in the South, that's where 96% of slaves were, they got a boost for having slavery in terms of their representation, both in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. So a state, for example, like Virginia, which had 450 or so people after the first census, free people, which was comparable to what Pennsylvania had, you would think that they would get the same number of electors, the same amount of weight in choosing the president. But because Virginia also had 300,000 slaves on top of that, well, it got a boost. It got 5 additional electoral votes. So despite their equal free populations, the 300,000 slaves that Virginia had gave it more power in choosing the president over its most closest state population-wise.
I just want to let everyone know, if you aren't confused and astonished, you haven't been paying attention, because this is incredible. What was the practical impact of this idea on who actually got elected president in those days?
So the practical impact is quite stark. If you look at the first 36 years of the country, 32 of those years, the presidency was held by a slave-holding Virginian. And that's stark enough itself. But when you think about the powers that the president has, choosing ambassadors, choosing members of the Supreme Court, well, that means that slavery infected the entire system of government. It's not surprising that most of the Supreme Court in the earlier years was occupied by members who were sympathetic to slavery. So yes, early on, lots of slave-holding presidents. Even after that, slave-sympathizing presidents, and that reverberated throughout the country itself in the way that the government was structured.
You're saying that racism and slavery essentially formed the most important institutions of this country in the years that the country itself was being formed.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll quibble a little bit because I'm not sure if we thought about the presidency as being the most important, but certainly one of the most important. And we think about it being the most important now, but certainly one of the most important ones. It was affected by slavery. But then, as I said, because the Senate and the president choose the courts, then it also infected the courts as well. So 2 of our most important institutions were deeply infected with slavery. It's astonishing, maybe, for people who don't think about this history, but I'm so deeply entrenched in this at this point, it's kind of just par for the course.
Okay, let's move from history to events that we can all remember, we've all lived through. And I mentioned the Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump election a few moments ago. So let's just go look at the result there. Hillary Clinton won, as we mentioned, 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. She got roughly 48% of the popular vote. Donald Trump got 46%. And you can see, in terms of the Electoral College, not only didn't Hillary Clinton win, it wasn't even close.
And so this is like one of the other things that the Electoral College does. Because it gives inflated sort of power, inflates the number of electoral votes that any particular states, particularly on the smaller side, get, it sort of exaggerates what a victory looks like and sometimes inverts what a victory looks like. So for the most part, the winner of the popular election wins the presidency because they also win the Electoral College. But there have been 5 times in history where that has not been the case, including 2 times in the last 25 years. And so something that was a popular win by nearly 3 million votes, as you noted up front, becomes an Electoral College loss and a loss of the White House. And to be clear, it was close even in the last election. Joe Biden won by even more of a margin than Hillary Clinton, nearly 8 million votes over Donald Trump. And yet, had you changed a handful of states, just some thousands of votes, 40,000 votes in about 3 or 4 states, you would have had changed the entire outcome. Donald Trump would have been reelected despite losing the popular vote by 8 million.
So there is the bizarre outcome every time Americans elect a president, and you draw our attention to it. Can we at least be reassured that the racist impact is limited and that the system, however bizarre and unfair, is at this point colorblind?
No. So the problem here is, and I think it's useful to kind of use Black people again because how this all played out, right? Slavery, most slaves were coming to the South, and therefore the way that Black communities have developed, most of them are still in the South, right? About 60% or so of the Black population of the country is located in the states. The Electoral College also has this other aspect, which is this winner-take-all aspect. Now, every state can choose how they allocate their electors, and 48 plus the District of Columbia give all of their electors, all of their electoral votes to whoever wins at just one more vote in that state than their candidate, their opposition candidate. So if I win one more vote than you in one state, then I win all of the electors. It doesn't matter how close it is. Well, in the South, where Black people are a substantial minority, they would generally impact the outcome of the sort of the presidency if their votes counted directly. But because it doesn't, all of their votes are wasted. That's to say that they vote for the president in a sea of white voters, and so their votes just don't matter. They're never going to win a majority because they're not that large. But because they're less than that, then that means it all is for nothing. And so how this plays out is weird, because there have been times where people have tried to get rid of the Electoral College. So if we look to 1969 to 1970, we were close to eliminating the Electoral College. The House of Representatives passed a measure by more than 2/3 to amend the Constitution to get rid of the Electoral College. When that went to the Senate, which had to pass it by the same majority, over 2/3, it was filibustered, and it was filibustered by Southern segregationists. And the reason was very clear, because they had a substantial size Black population that voted opposite the way that they did, right? And so by maintaining the Electoral College, the Southern segregationists knew that they were able to basically waste the votes of their substantial size Black population. Plays out differently based on how concentrated one racial minority is in one area than they are in another. But again, using the South as a sort of glimpse of what's going on, it shows that the racial interaction, the racial dynamics of the Electoral College have not disappeared entirely.
I read about this because of your writing, and I was surprised when I read about it, and then I was ashamed that I was surprised because I didn't know. How many Americans do know about this aspect of this strange system that they really only think about once every 4 years? How many Americans know the history here?
I don't think most Americans know. One is because it comes up every 4 years, really, right? That's what I'm mostly talking about this. This is when most scholars who think about this are talking about this. And so just as much as they're paying attention to the presidency, the presidential election, that's probably how much time they're, even less time, to the system by which they're elected. So I don't think most know. I do teach this, so my students quickly learn it. They either Google me before they have me as a professor, or they'll learn it in day 1 or 2 of my election law class for how this system works. And some of them are shocked. I think, and all of them are ashamed. That much is clear, irrespective of where they fall on the sort of ideological spectrum, and I don't presume to know from all my students. They all are pretty ashamed for how the system has grown and developed and sort of become sort of so entwined with our odious racial history.
Just one last question for you, and is this as important as it is? Is it an outlier in American politics? Are there other things as odious as this that we aren't talking about today, that we'll talk about another time maybe, that keep American politics as racist as the Electoral College system was in its inception?
So I'd say it's not a complete outlier. It is very important because it is the sole person who is elected to represent the entire country, everybody, right? And so it's really front of mind, or it should be. It is certainly for scholars like me. But if we look at the other parts of the government as well, they interact with it. And so I mentioned the Supreme Court. Well, the president gets to nominate members of the Supreme Court and other federal judges. And so if the president is chosen through a system that interacts with our bad, terrible racial history and sort of continuing racial problems and discrimination, then the Supreme Court is also going to reflect that. Likewise with the Senate, right? Every state gets 2 senators irrespective of its size. And that means for those states where there's a large minority population, which are the larger states, well, they get sort of cheated out of representation as well. So if we look at the smallest states, they tend to be much whiter than the larger states. And so, the racial aspect plays into our core system pretty deeply, and it impacts how the country is governed because it impacts how we choose our elected officials broadly. But the Electoral College is, I think, probably at least the most important because it is most tangible, noticeable, and sort of bizarre in terms of trying to understand why it exists in the first instance.
Wilfred Codrington, thanks so much.